Welcome to Hard Talk with me, Sarah Montague. Throughout President Obama's time in office, my guest today was by his side, one of his closest confidants. His title was Deputy National Security Advisor, but Ben Rhodes developed such a close bond with Barack Obama that he earned a reputation for being able to anticipate the president's thinking, and White House insiders described him as the single most influential voice shaping American foreign policy aside from the president. In his new memoir of his time in the Obama administration, he says, "I don't know anymore where I begin and Obama ends." So what does he feel about the new occupant of the White House and what he's doing with their legacy? Ben Rhodes, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you.
How do you explain your connection to President Obama?
Well, it's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, to try to explore that. But I think fundamentally, he was running for president in 2008 as an outsider, and he hadn't built up the network of people around him that most people who run for president do. Hillary Clinton had kind of sucked up the Democratic machine. And I was coming in as a relative political outsider, a newcomer at 29 years old. And I think we shared a frustration. I got into politics for some of the same reasons he was running for president, that after September 11th and those attacks, that our government had gotten it wrong. It gotten it wrong in the Iraq War, gotten it wrong in a number of other decisions. And so we entered into this process with the same, I think, shared sense of trying to make change. The other reason, though, that's important is when you're a speechwriter, you have to get inside someone's head, because you have to learn how to write in their voice and how do they think and how do they talk. And so it was kind of my job, frankly, to be able to anticipate what he wanted to say and what he wanted to do. Indeed,
but people seem to suggest that in a sense it almost went further, because you have speechwriters for lots of politicians.
Yeah.
But you obviously had, was it that your personalities were similar?
Yeah, I think we did have some similarities in personality. We have very different backgrounds, obviously. He's a mixed race from Hawaii. I'm from New York. But I think we had a similar sense of frustration, I think, with, again, the way things have been going in American politics and foreign policy. We had a sensibility of being outsiders, even when we were inside the White House, which I know sounds strange, but we never lost that sense.
How would you describe him if you were, when you talk about having similar personalities? How would you describe him?
I describe him as somebody who is ultimately, at the end of the day, a very pragmatic person who wants to make decisions and do things based on common sense. If something hasn't worked in the past, we should do it differently. I think he's also someone who has a bit of a unique background and that could be misread in both directions, from the left and the right. The notion that he was, from the right, some kind of radical, I think was deeply misplaced. He came from a background where he was essentially an institutionalist. He had a father who was from Kenya, came to America, got educated, went back, and found that there were no institutions, and it was a politics devoted to corruption, patronage, and that ultimately knocked his father out of politics, blacklisted him. Obama believed you needed to make change through institutions. And from the left, I think, there was this sense that Obama was never going far enough, but I think they needed to understand, too, that he was going to push the boundaries of how much he could promote positive change without upending the entire system.
Okay, now you mentioned that it was seeing America's response to 9/11 that brought you into politics. But you've also written about the moment of 9/11, seeing the planes go into the towers that actually changed the course of what you wanted to do.
Yeah, I was 24 and I was in graduate school for fiction writing. And working on local political campaigns, too. And I thought I was going to become a writer, maybe go into publishing. And I saw a kind of unobstructed view of the second plane hit and then the first tower collapse. And I knew in that moment that what I was going to do with my life was going to somehow be about the response to those events, to those attacks. I actually went to an Army recruiter, and I had every intention of signing up. but they didn't really know what to make of me. They're not all creative writing graduate students who joined the military, so they couldn't really make a sell. They couldn't really describe what I would be doing, and ultimately.
What did you think you would be doing?
I didn't know. I wanted to be a part of how we, the United States, responded to this event. What that ultimately led me to is Washington, try to be a journalist writing about foreign policy.
And it was when when Barack Obama was a senator that he noticed you.
Yes, I had worked, I had the luck to work for the 9/11 Commission in the United States and also something called the Iraq Study Group that basically assessed the two twin events that defined the first decade of the 21st century. So I had that expertise, and I was a speechwriter. Obama needed to put together a team. And I basically, I wanted to work for him. And I started working for free, not even knowing if it would lead anywhere. I'd write memos, I'd write speeches, and that ultimately got me in the door to meet Barack Obama.
Okay, and there was the moment that he noticed you. Was there something that you recall? You write about a particular meeting.
Yeah, and it was this common sense thread that I was talking about. I walked into a meeting where they were debating whether he should vote for a bill to fund the Iraq War when he was in the Senate. I was so nervous that I didn't want to speak. I was afraid he was going to call on me because I knew I couldn't speak in paragraphs. So when it came my turn to talk, because he calls on everybody in the room, that's what he always does, I said, look, you have a plan for Iraq, don't you? And he said, yes. And I said, your plan does X, Y, and Z, right? And he said, yes. And I said, so why would you vote for this bill? You should vote against it. And the debate up to that point had been about politics. Would he look weak if he didn't vote to fund this, or how would this be received? And he immediately connected to, wait a second, this is actually the straightforward approach. I don't believe in this, so I won't vote for it. And he came over to me, shook my hand, said, hey, I'm Barack. I'm glad you're with us.
Now, since then, of course, you left office. President Trump has taken over. A great deal has changed.
Yeah.
He's undone the Iran deal, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Paris Climate Accord, Cuba. There have been any number of complete changes. What do you make of those changes, things that you, with President Obama, put in place?
Well, first of all, I think, Trump, in the absence of a coherent worldview, one of his organizing principles is essentially, if Obama did it, I'm going to try to undo it. And it's very difficult.
Do you think that's what's driving him?
I think that's part of what is driving him, absolutely. If you look at the Iran deal, for instance, we see him pull out of that agreement, declaring it a disaster, even though it has inspections in it and timelines associated with it and requirements on Iran. And then he goes to North Korea and gets kind of an empty commitment to denuclearize and declares it a huge success. I mean, there's not a substantive basis for why you would do one thing, pull out of Iran, and then do the other thing with North Korea. For me personally, the hardest thing is on some of those policies, particularly Cuba, where I had negotiated that with the Cubans and the Vatican. I knew that when we did that, we really raised people's expectations in Cuba. I remember traveling down to Cuba and people said to me, things are finally going to change here for the better. And I feel like those people are being let down. And that personally makes me feel distressed.
But on Iran, President Trump has made the point that he says it's a horrible one-sided deal that should never, ever have been made. And he has the support of Israel in that. Benjamin Netanyahu calling it a recipe for disaster, a disaster for our region and for the peace of the world.
Yeah, but I mean, Trump has never articulated why it's a disaster. I actually don't think...
Well, one of the reasons is that there is effectively an expiry in it.
Yes, but the fact of the matter is, if you were concerned about Iran's nuclear program, if the worst thing you can say is that parts of this expire in 10 or 15 years, why would you blow it up now? Wait 10 or 15 years.
The fact that it doesn't take on what Iran may be doing elsewhere with sponsoring terrorism.
Look, that I think completely fails to hold up when you consider that Trump just went and embraced Kim Jong-un, said nothing about human rights, said nothing about their assassinations in third countries.
As far as Iran is concerned, I mean, because in your book, and this is your memoir, The World as It Is, in that book you made clear that in 8 years there was nothing in foreign policy that was as fiercely contested as this nuclear deal. I mean, you hadn't won people over.
No, well, what was interesting about it is that diplomacy was more contested than war in the United States. A lot of that, again, can be attributed to the fact that you had the Prime Minister of Israel, for instance, and his voice matters a lot in the United States, who opposed this deal. The fact of the matter is that Prime Minister Netanyahu just ideologically was in a totally different place. He didn't support that type of diplomacy with Iran. our argument to him and to opponents in the U.S. Congress always was, if you're concerned about what Iran does in the region, then you should want to prevent them from getting a nuclear weapon. You know, you don't make nuclear deals with your friends, you make them with your adversaries.
It comes down to the pragmatism that you're talking
exactly.
about. Okay, well, let's take a look at Syria, which arguably is probably one of the biggest foreign policy failures of your time in the White House. What President has done there, there were reprisals for the use of chemical weapons, something that President Obama didn't do.
Yeah. Well, look, President Obama's concern was that a limited military strike wasn't going to improve things in Syria, that you weren't going to affect the course of that war, you weren't going to stop Assad from killing his people just by launching a limited cruise missile strike. Trump's attacks, in a way, have borne that out. He blew up a runway, they built it the next day.
But President Obama had a red line. He had a stated red line. A red line for us, if we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilised, that would change my calculus, that would change my equation. And then they were used, and nothing happened.
Yes, and I describe my own wrenching experience of Syria in the book. I was a huge advocate for military intervention, including in the days after that chemical weapons attack. What he decided, and I really wanted to let people into the decision-making process, is I already think that there's not a military solution to this. He was still prepared to go forward with a strike after that chemical weapons attack, but he wanted to make sure that it was set up to succeed. And what he found is he didn't have international support, and he didn't have domestic support from the U.S. Congress, and he had the U.S. Congress saying it'd be unconstitutional if he did this without their authorization. And so he made a determination, if I act in that capacity, if I act without that support, what I think is already a very unlikely course in terms of being able to change things in Syria with our military, will definitely fail, because I can't sustain it without that support. So he went to Congress, ultimately, to try to get their support, and couldn't.
Do you accept that, as a result, he and America were seen to look weak?
I accept that. I mean, there's no question. But I also think, you know, he used to say to me, going to war someplace just to show that you don't look weak is not a good reason to go to war. If you look at American history, that's how we ended up staying in Vietnam for years after we should have left, and bombing Cambodia and Laos, just to show that we were tough and we weren't weak. He was willing to take that criticism rather than get into a war that he thought couldn't succeed.
Okay.
And,
But there were consequences from that, and not least spelt out by his own Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, which was, I think, that Putin, Russian President Putin, saw the United States withdrawing from around the world. I think actually the problem's been that President Obama's actions have not matched his rhetoric, and it sent a signal that the US was in retreat. Do you accept that it did embolden Russia?
No. And look, I find fault in our Syria policy. I want to be very clear, like, nobody can be satisfied with this outcome. But on that particular analysis, I actually think what Putin was responding to, and lashing out in Ukraine in particular, was a sense actually that we were encircling him, that there had been 2 decades of NATO expansion, EU expansion, the US had fought wars of regime change in Iraq and Libya, and he interpreted the protests that overthrew Yanukovych as being generated by the United States. I don't agree with his view, but again, I think Putin was lashing out in Ukraine in particular, and then in our election, because he actually thought that we were pressing Russia, not that we were withdrawing from around the world.
But now you mentioned in the election,
yeah,
and the former CIA chief who became Defense Secretary, Leon Panetta, even said about that, I think when Putin conducted the cyber attacks in the United States during the last election, he felt he could get away with it without any kind of response. Again, it's that criticism that actually there isn't a belief that President Obama was going to do anything.
Well, I actually, the fault I find in our response to the Russian intervention is that when we did make a public statement and a warning about it, and we focused on the cyber attack, you know, that they hacked the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, they released these emails. There was this massive information war taking place where they're creating and disseminating huge volumes of fake news about Hillary Clinton that is flooding the social media feeds of tens of millions of Americans potentially. I don't think we gave enough of that context to people. I don't think it wasn't as much about, you know, punching Russia back. We did that. We imposed sanctions. We expelled diplomats. I actually think that where we could have done more was on conditioning the public for what Russia was doing. Obama's view was essentially that the people consuming that type of news we're not inclined to listen to him. That if you're reading stories about Hillary Clinton and how corrupt she is, or she's not healthy, that Barack Obama is not the person to tell you that's fake news and that's not.
Were you urging him to speak out about it?
Yeah, and I described in the book. I said that's the exact change I had with him. I said, look, we're warning people about the cyber piece of this, but we're not painting the picture of the fake news, which I had seen in Ukraine. They developed this capability to generate fake news in the Ukraine war context. And Obama would say to me, look, if I say that, we can't become the editor-in-chief of Facebook. We can't say this is fake, this isn't, and Trump will say it's rigged. That was his view.
But you go further in your book, because you make the talk about what happened on January the 5th. The leadership of the intelligence community filed into the Oval Office. This is a couple of weeks ahead of the President Trump's inauguration, briefing on the report of Russian meddling. And in that, you say they painted a stark picture of a methodical and relentless campaign waged by Putin on behalf of Trump.
Yes. Yeah.
Did they suggest to you that Donald Trump knew about that campaign?
They did not. And in fact, in the U.S. government, at least the way it used to function, the FBI doesn't tell the White House about investigations of Americans. I actually was shocked to learn about the fact of an FBI investigation into Trump campaign collusion with Russia, that had started during our administration. I learned about that in the press after we left. The FBI piece of that was kind of walled off. We knew about Russian interference on behalf of Trump.
Yes, but in terms of what were you told about the extent of the Russian meddling and who? I mean, you're not suggesting that President Trump knew about it.
I don't know whether he did or not. We were told, first of all, before the election, we were told that they were doing this, that they were hacking these political organizations, releasing these emails, working with WikiLeaks, creating fake news. After the election, President Obama ordered a review of all the intelligence that we had about this. What happened? That ultimately led up to that meeting in the Oval Office. The picture that they pieced together between the election and the inauguration became more and more alarming. The scale of the Russian effort became clearly bigger. And frankly, what they were also finding were potentially these contacts between Trump associates and Russians.
Are you saying without that effort on the part of the Russians, President Trump would not have won the vote as he did?
I think it's always hard to say after an election that this caused this. But yes, I think there's no question that the Russian influence had an influence on the outcome. Whether it was the determining factor, you can never get in the minds of voters. What I do know is if you've got millions of voters reading lots of stories and hacked emails provided by the Russians to support one candidate, and the whole election is decided by 100,000 votes in 3 states, it's quite likely that the Russians swung the election.
And that is a situation that could still now exist?
They could do this again in the midterm election, the congressional election coming up. They'll try to do it in the next election. And Trump's refusal to even acknowledge that this happened. I mean, he is the President of the United States, and his own intelligence community is telling him this happened, and he calls it a witch hunt. He says that he's denying even the fact of that Russian campaign on his behalf. Now,
you are critical of President Trump's successes, but there will be those, not least your fellow Democrat Bernie Sanders, who said of the meeting in North Korea with Kim Jong-un that it was a positive step in de-escalating tensions. Will you give him any form of acknowledgement that that was a success?
I would not call it a success. What I would say is I prefer that to war. So I'm glad that he's pursuing diplomacy with the North Koreans. That is far preferable to a conflict. What I saw, though, in watching that is look, I described the Iran deal. It took years to tee that up. Cuba, 2 years of secret negotiations before Obama got in the room with Raul Castro. He wanted the spectacle of the meeting, and they didn't do the homework. They didn't know what they wanted to get out of the North Koreans. So what happens? The North Koreans get the international legitimacy that comes with a meeting with the president, which they've never had. They're probably going to get sanctions relief out of it, because if you're China, why would you enforce the sanctions after this big spectacle has happened in Singapore? He praises Kim Jong-un as beloved by his people, which will be running on a loop on North Korean state television. And in return, the North Koreans promise to denuclearize. The same promise that they've broken to 3 U.S. presidents: no timeline, no inspections.
You say that President Trump, you think, is in part setting out to undo the legacy of your time in the White House with President Obama. Why do you think he's trying to do that?
Well, he's always had deep-seated hostility towards President Obama. And keep in mind, this is a guy who launched his political career essentially on the birther movement. The notion that he was a chief proponent of the notion that Obama was not born in the United States, demanded that he release his birth certificate. So the animus has been there all along. And again, frankly, there's not a logic that would lead someone to the set of positions he's taken. You know, no Iran deal, no Paris deal, no TPP. I'm going to stop the Cuba opening. There's not a consistency that marries these positions, other than the fact that they're the opposite of what Obama was doing.
When you write about how the Republicans worked with Obama, you talk about racism. You say it was there in the refusal of Republicans in Congress to work with him for 8 full years, something that Obama was also blamed for no matter what he did. Do you think that President Trump's opposition, not least which you mention is founded on the birther movement, was racist?
Yes. Not entirely, but I absolutely believe that, look, this is a man, again, who declares publicly over and over again that the first African-American president wasn't born in the United States, he was born in Africa. I mean, sometimes you have to call it what it is. That's racist.
President Obama never did.
Not publicly, and I describe in the book.
Did he privately?
Yes, and you know, and I say in the book, you know, he would be. You come out in a weird way, you know, we'd be discussing how to answer questions on a tough show like this, and we say, you know, how much of the opposition to your presidency do you think is rooted in race? Or, you know, do you think it is? And he'd say, yes, of course, next question. But he wasn't going to say that in public. His judgment was, if he starts talking about racism in public like that, anything else he wants to talk about, no one's going to pay attention to. You know, if he's trying to build support for a health care bill or an Iran nuclear agreement.
So how much racism did you see against him?
I saw a lot. I mean, look, you know, he faced a stridency of opposition. Some of it was overt, by the way. I mean, some of it was not subtle. You know, Southern congressmen standing up and yelling at him that you lie in the middle of his speeches. You know, the birther conspiracies, the kind of toxic conspiracy theorizing constantly about the Obamas. The double standards, you know, if Obama played golf, you know, it was all about how dare he. Trump plays golf every weekend.
Do you think that was rooted in racism? Because there were people who just didn't like his politics.
That's
and
fine.
there was a large part of the country that didn't like his politics.
That, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. But I think that you'd have to be willfully blind to think that none of that was about racism. I mean, the Donald Trump's coalition is overwhelmingly white. You know, it's not and rooted in states like the American South that have long histories of racial politics.
So for you now, and you still do work with President Obama, what is it like watching what you created, what you did in the White House being undone?
It's difficult, you know. I have to say, though, you develop, when you've spent 8 years in the White House, a bit of a sense of the longer view of these things. On the individual issues, you know, the pendulum can swing back just as hard as it swung to Trump, you know, and like I said, the next U.S. president can come back into the Paris Climate Agreement, can pick up the Cuba policy. So for me, it's actually less the individual policies and more just the office of the presidency. The way he conducts himself in office is kind of unrecognizable to me. So, you know, it's more difficult than if it was some other Republican who didn't like our policies doing it. It's the fact that Trump shows such a disregard for just the stewardship of that office.
But if President Trump is president in the White House for one term, are you suggesting that actually could be just a blip because somebody else could come in and?
I think there's a huge difference between 1 and 2 terms. You know, as I described in the book, but a lot of the biggest change you make is in your second term because there's a long runway to get things done. It takes years to build support or to get your people in the government to get things done. I do think, though, that even one term, you know, Trump is going to do a lot of damage, not just to the Obama legacy, but to the expectations that Americans have in their leaders, and frankly, to how the rest of the world looks at us. I mean, I think the rest of the world is looking at this situation and thinking, it's not just Trump, but how did this country elect Trump? And, you know, why is he picking fights with our allies and solicitous of people like Putin? And I think that's not as simple as just replacing him. I think that America is going to have to build back some trust.
Ben Rhodes, thank you for coming on Hard Talk.
Thanks a lot. Enjoyed it.